Okay, so before the break, we had just created a message component. We sent in some properties, and then we displayed these properties. There's a few different ways we said. One of them is to use like a ternary operator to see if you have a specific property that you're looking for, and if not, to display an alternative text. And the same way to do this is by creating a function that returns what you want to display. So if props.subtext exists, then you can return this, else you can return this. And the way you call it is through calling the function itself, and it'll evaluate to one of these. So either this text or this text. Okay, I'm going to comment this one out. So we talked about props. Let's talk about state. Where's my, so here. So we were mentioning about not editing state and props like manually. Yes, we are recording. So when you're in your child component, so this is the parent component app, right? And then child component is whatever components are in here. So all of these are children of app. So if you want to edit a prop, don't edit it here. You don't want to say props dot greeting equals something. Instead, just change it over here. And yeah, because sometimes you get weird yeah, you can't assign. So properties are read-only, and you can't reassign it. So props, if you want to change them in the parent component when they're getting sent in to the child component. So we said props are external data values. They're sent down from the parent. States, on the other hand, are internal data values for a component. So if we want to keep track of certain data within your component, and that data is being rendered to the screen or being used in conditionals or whatever it is to help the rendering, you want to use state. So let's try a little example here. So we see here an example. I'm going to create a new component so we can play around with it. I'm going to call this component button counter .jsx. So this is the file, and then I'm going to create a new component. So like I said, you can do function button counter, and you can do it in this syntax, or if you'd like, which is I think used a lot in React itself, is just using the arrow function syntax. So button counter equals function, and then you want to export default button counter. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Okay, you want to export it, and then inside of each component you have a return, and within this return is going to be whatever data you want to return, or whatever HTML and components you want to return. So I'm going to just start it off with a div and then put everything inside of that. Okay, so let's say this button, for this button counter component, I want to have a button, and I want to have maybe a label or some sort of output. So I'm just going to use a p tag actually. So in here, I'm going to say, okay, like me to increment. I just want this to, every time I click, I increment a certain counter, and then I want to display the count that I'm incrementing. So for now, let me just say, you've clicked the button 0 times. I don't have a variable that's holding this information. Okay. So when we want to create a variable that holds information that is dynamically being updated, I want to use something called the use state hook. So from React, I'm going to be importing something called use state. And it's a function. So use state from React. Okay. So what this function does is it returns 2 things. So constant something equals, so when we create use state, it's a function that returns 2 things, our actual variable with an initial state. So I want to call my variable counter. That is not what I wanted to do. Okay. Probably because I put constant wrong. Okay. So I want a counter, or I'm just going to say count actually. So this will hold the actual count value, and then it'll also return a function that we can use to update this. So I'm going to call this set count. For this, I have to actually put it in square brackets because it returns, this is how it returns it. It returns 2 elements in an array-like structure. So we're actually just going to grab the 2 elements like this. So use state will take in our initial value. So if I don't put anything in here, it'll initialize count to null. And if I put here, let's say we're going to start our count at 0. So use state is going to create a variable for us. It'll create a state for us that is called count, that will hold our count information. And then it'll also return a set count function. These are also just aliases. So this name and this name can be changed to whatever we want, but this is generally the convention. So whatever it is, and then set whatever it is. So this function will allow us to actually manipulate the data. So if we want to increment, if we want to change what's in this variable, we have to go through this. We can't just say count equals something. So count equals 4 now. We have to say set count and send in the new value that we want. Okay. Okay, so this is, yeah, we've set up our new state count, and we want that to be displayed here. So I'm gonna use the curly braces and just put count in here. So whenever I have this element, it'll display my count for me dynamically. So I'm gonna, I have this button counter. I didn't import it anywhere. I just exported it here. So I'm gonna go into my app and import it so we can display it on our screen. I'm gonna remove a few of these messages. Okay, and then I'm going to import. So I'm gonna import my button counter from components slash button counter. I don't need these. So those were there from the previous example. All right, so button counter, I don't need all the space, and I'm just gonna render it here. So button counter, and we've seen this is a self-closing tag. This is just so you don't have to do this. This slash is supposed to go first. So instead of doing this, you can just put the slash right here and remove the closing tag. And this is self-closing. Just because we don't actually want to put any text within this component, we can just, yeah, it just displays whatever's there. Okay, so now that we have this here, if I hit save, now I see a button here. If I click it, nothing will happen because I didn't actually do anything. I'm gonna, what am I gonna serve here? I'm just gonna print out like some sort of line so we can see the difference here. All right, so we have our button counter, and we have our message that says you've clicked the button 0 times, and I want to increment this count every time I click on a button. So we've seen before that buttons have an on-click event. So it has an on-click attribute. Okay, so on-click, we can set it equal to a certain function that we define. So I can define here a function that will handle my my button click. So I'm going to call this increment counter. And this is a function, arrow function syntax. And so like I said, count equals count plus 1. Oops. I'm actually going to show you what happens and why we don't want to use this. So okay, so here we do not update state manually. So this is not something we want to do. So what happens here if actually let's do this real quick. I'm going to comment this out. So okay, let's go back a little bit. I created a function called increment counter, and I'm going to use this to be my on-click function. So in here, I just say increment counter. So this will be the function that gets clicked when my button gets clicked. I don't need to put the parentheses afterwards because I'm not calling the function when this button is defined. I want it to be called when the click event happens. So all I have to do is actually just send in the function name and it'll do what I want. So right now, I'm just gonna print count. I'm gonna look at my console real quick. I think I didn't update this. Okay, cool. So here, this is my console. If I click, nothing is actually happening. Oh, I didn't save my page. That makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna refresh. Okay, so now every time I click, I'm getting a console log. So that means my function is connected to my button, which is awesome. So we can't do this One, because this is constant. So someone mentioned, oh, Kayla, you're mentioning the error. So this is a constant because we don't want to update it. So even if it was a let, so it wasn't a constant. If we update, it'll update the count, but we'll see later when we're displaying this count, oh, actually we see now. So it's not actually updating this count variable, right? So we have it here, let me close this. We have it displayed here. And even though we set count equals count plus 1, and we're getting the correct one, so we're getting an updated count every time, right? We're updating count, we're printing it out. It's not actually going to update this one here. And that is because with React, it only renders specific components. So it only re-renders specific components. So when things are changed on this page, it's not going to reload the entire page for you. It's actually only going to only re-render the components with data that has changed. So if we're updating count like this, there's no way for React to know that this count variable has changed. So it's not going to update this. But if I use, so instead of this, if I use set count, so this function that was provided to us, and this is gonna, I'm just gonna say count plus 1. Okay. Refresh, I don't think I had to, but if I click it, now it's updating it. So now React can recognize that this count has been updated because we used the set count function. That is something that the use state hook does for us. And they call it a hook. It's basically a set of functionality that allows you to do things. So there's use state, there's a few other ones that we'll learn about later as well. Any questions about this?
I got a couple of errors. I'm messed up somewhere, I guess.
What is it saying, or what are the?
Let's see. It says I have an assignment to a constant variable. I'm trying to.
So make sure you see here how I have line 12, where I'm assigning count equals count plus 1. Keep that commented out because that is not what we want to do. That was just showing a bad example of this.
Okay.
Yeah, so that should fix it for you.
Is React just super picky about casing?
How
Because like I when I first defined button counter, I used camel casing and I got an error that said you're using incorrect casing. And when I changed it to have my initial letter uppercase, everything worked.
Yeah, I think React likes its components to have a capital letter. Yeah. So the file name doesn't have to be capital. So here I created buttoncounter.jsx with a lowercase b, but your actual component name should be capital.
That didn't fix it.
Yeah.
Hey, what guys, the error that I was having is usually like for the buttons, we would just type on click and you wouldn't like camel case on click, but I did not, so it wasn't working for me. Maybe that's what's going on with you. You have to like capital.
Did it work, you said, or no?
No, mine's camel cased. It's still not working.
So do you have everything the same on the screen?
I believe I do.
Do you want to work it out or look at it in a bit?
You can keep going. I'm just
So what is the error saying, actually?
it says it's on my button counter JS6 that I have an assignment to a constant variable, but I have that's your line 9 is my line 6, and I have the same, and I've put lead and it doesn't change it.
Share your screen if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah. React errors sometimes show up in the terminal on the bottom. They sometimes only show up in the browser. They sometimes only show up in the console of the browser. So those areas are worth checking when you have something that isn't rendering what you expect. Okay, so this is your set count.
Is that weird on line 6? Should it just be like get the equal sign out of there?
Oh, yes. On line 6 at the end, use state, there's no equal there. So use state is a function and you're calling it and sending in the initial value.
Cool.
So refresh and it should. It works? Okay, cool. Awesome.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know why that showed up. Okay. Okay, so we used our state, our use state hook takes in an initial value for whatever state you want to create, and then it sends back the actual state variable that we can use, and then it also sends back a function that allows us to edit this variable. And going through this function, using this function to update count allows React to know when things are updated. So it'll everywhere count is used, it'll refresh that component. And we saw before when we updated it manually, this variable here did not update. So here it's updating normally. If I uncomment this and I refresh, oh, I'm getting a different error because I'm setting it to constant. But basically, don't do this. Don't set it on manually. So if I click, I see that I am changing count, but it's not updating here. It's not updating inside of this paragraph tag where it's used. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this.
Then I have a question though. On the on-click button, right? Why are we not just calling the function set count and just do count plus 1?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, you can. So we can do set count, and then set count plus 1. Actually, I believe this has to take a function, so you can just do this to simulate that this is a function. So you create the arrow function in line pretty much, and this allows you to put all that information in here. So if there isn't much functionality, you can put it in line, but if there is more stuff that you need, it's more than just one line of code. Put it in its own separate function, and then you can call it in here. Gonna go back to increment counter. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So I would like you to look at this terminal right here, the console. So when I click, this is updating to 1, but it's printing out 0. So here we set count and then we print it out. So it's it's printing out a stale version of the counter. So if I click again, this one, the count is actually 2, but it has printed out 1. This is because when the set count happens, it happens asynchronously, and sometimes it's a little too slow it doesn't catch up with whatever, it doesn't happen before printing out the next line or before executing the next line. So if you had a bunch of set counts here, so let's say I wanted to increment by 2, and I wanted to print out, so I wanted to increment it by 2, and yeah, that's it. So now if I click it, it's only incrementing once because I'm setting the count to whatever the count currently is plus 1. And count doesn't actually get updated until this is all done. So it's because of that, I can't use it in succession. So a way to get around that is to use something, is to use this. So instead of just using the count itself, I have access to a variable here. So set count gives me access to a certain variable that is the previous count or the previous value of whatever this was. So set count specifically is a function that updates this state. So this gives me access to the previous state. And here is where I'm sending in the updated state. So now I can say, take the previous count and add 1. So if I do this, previous count gets updated before count itself has time to update. So if I do this, this is actually going to give me a correct increment. So before I was only able to increment once, even though I had it in succession. So if I hit this here, oh, I didn't save my code. Okay. Phew. So now it increments by 2. So it's taking the previous state of whatever this count variable was, and then we can use it in here. So I can do whatever manipulation I want to it. Same thing if I just added a few more. So if I add 2 more, oops, that'll increment it by 4, right? So if I refresh, I do that. Oh, I forgot to save again. Okay, now it's incremented by 4 and then by 8. Versus before, if I just had this count sorry, not here. So if I just had that be count plus 1 for all of these, count wouldn't have been updated by the time I want to use this, but set count does, or sorry, but the previous state gets updated. So I have access to the previous state first. I know this is a little, I don't know if this is confusing, but anyone have questions on this?
Yeah, so so this use state, like when we have an array, when we're setting up the use state, constant is an array of count and set count. So you're saying that set count is just like a kind of like a built-in function for a use state?
Exactly. It's a built-in function that allows you to update this variable. And it has certain functionality that React uses on the back end to update all the places where this is present. So where this state is present, I think there's like a flag, an internal flag that it sets to say that this has been updated. So now you can go in, you can go and update all the components that contain that variable. So within set count, within this function, you have access to the previous version of whatever this count was. And this previous count, so this is also an alias, so I can name it whatever I would like. So this previous value of state gets updated before I have access to it in this variable. So that's why if I want to use these within the same function, I should use this previous variable to update. Instead of using this outside variable. So again, this is only in the case where you need to use the set count in succession, and it's building off of the previous state. So if I want to update it once and then update it again, so here I have to use the previous state to update that instead of count the variable that we have on the outside.
And is use state of 0 just like a convention, or is use state of 1 do something different?
Yeah, so this is the value that is going to be initialized, or this is the value that count is going to be initialized to. So if I wanted to initialize this as an empty list, I can just put empty list here. If I wanted to initialize it to an object that contains maybe something called count and then something or whatever it is, this is basically the initial value of your state. And here, since we're doing a count, I would probably want to start at 0, so that's why I have it 0. I'm going to comment these up. Other questions?
I guess my question is why we're using like a destructuring assignment on count and set count. Is that just like how we have to do it because set count is a function and it's corresponding to count? Or
are you talking about this?
Yeah.
So the destructuring is because use state returns 2 things.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It basically returns an array of 2 things, which is kind of a little weird. We haven't really seen it much, but we destructure it just so we can use it more easily. So you have access to your variable, and then you have access to the function that sets the variable.
That makes sense.
Awesome.
Does set count keep all of your previous ones in general, or does it drop it off after like say you get 2 numbers? Is it going to remember 0, 4, then 8, or is it just going to be 4 and 8 after the next time?
Yeah, it'll just remember the immediate one before it, or like the last one that was there.
So it's not holding it like an array.
No, it's not holding the history of it. It's just whatever it was last. Yeah.
You're saying about aliases, is that just the capital count and the lowercase count, and set and prev are like those are not aliases, like those are parts of React? Or
No, this is just I guess it's just convention that people use to denote that this is the function. So you can name this anything. So counter setter function, if I want to call this, yeah. And then I would, instead of set count, I would say counter setter function. And if I save, this should do the same thing. Yeah, there we go.
so how does prev count work with counter setter function though?
It's also the same thing. So I can call this old count. And old count. If I refresh, it still works.
So anything that goes into those, like that parentheses before the arrow function is gonna be a previous count.
Yes.
How does it?
It's the current value of what this is. So the first iteration that I call this, right, count is 0. So when I get to here, I'm actually gonna go back to the old way of how we named it. Okay, so here count is 0. Previous count is also 0. So when I call set count this first time, it'll take 0 and it'll replace it with 0 plus 1. It'll say that now my value for count should be 0 plus 1. So when I go to this next line, the previous count, the current state value is updated in the back end, but maybe it hasn't had enough time to update this one here. So instead of using count here, we're gonna still use the previous value of the count. So now this is set to 1 because our count was updated over here. So we have access to 1, and now it's going to be 1 plus 1, which is 2. And that is our current latest count. So that's why when we click it, we see 2. So it's incrementing it 1 by 1 here.
Okay, so when you had it as count plus 1, it grabbed the variable from the constant, but then just because you put that arrow there, it now grabs from the previous.
It grabs from, so think of this as a variable that we have access to here. Inside of the state itself, it has its own variable that keeps track of things. So this is the variable that we keep track of things with. And this is the variable that we have access to. So this gets updated after set count gets called, but internally, when set count gets called, it'll update its own internal variable first. And then it'll get to the line of code that updates this external one. So that's why if we're using set counts in succession and they're all using the variable to build off of it, we want to use the internal variable instead of the external one, because the internal one is going to be updated in real time versus the external one is, there's a little bit of lag, pretty much. Did that make sense?
Yep.
Awesome. I missed the chat. Hold on. What is there anything I missed? Any questions that I had missed? No. All right. But yeah, this is basically how states work. So you have a variable that updates dynamically and a function that we use to update this variable. And whatever's in here is updated dynamically because we use the set function. So the components that use our state variable are going to be updated whenever we use the set count, whenever we use the function that is provided to update this state. Other questions? Has everyone been able to follow along with this? Everything's working?
I got a question real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So for previous count, could you just set count for that? And then after the arrow, just set count as well?
Yeah, so this is, I don't want to name it the same name as here, so our program doesn't get confused, but I can say count now or something like that. So you can name it whatever you want.
I was thinking like if you actually grab the variable count from the const, but never mind. I don't think you can do that.
So that was, yeah, that was the first, so if you're using count, you don't have to use these arrows. But like I showed before, the problem with that is, so if I comment these out, so if I'm just using count, and here I'm just using count. When I refresh, this only gets to happen once. So what is happening is when I'm setting the count the first time, it's going into this set count function that was created by useState. It internally updates the count, and then I don't know how much other stuff it does, but then it gets to a certain line of code that updates this outside count, which is what we're using on the second line, right? So when we want to use it on the second line, there's a bit of lag between when this gets executed and when this gets updated. So when we execute the set count function, this count state variable won't get updated immediately. So this line gets called before this gets a chance to update. And since this outside one is still at 0, it hasn't updated to 1, like we said over here, we're going to end up with setting the count to 0 plus 1 again, which is 1. So that's why even though we have this twice, when we click on the button, it's only updating once. But when we use this previous count, when we use this internal variable that it has, so I'm going to call this internal count. I think that's a better word. Okay. So it's using the internal one instead. And this we can count on to be updated immediately. So because we want to do it twice, we can use the internal count to increment instead of the outside, the external one. So this gets updated a little bit afterwards. So since we want to use these in succession, if I update this now, oops. Now it increments by 2. So 2, 4, 6, 8. Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I got another follow-up question with that. If you just wanted to increment it by 2, can't you just put set count, parentheses count plus 2 instead of plus 1?
Oh, yeah, 100%. This was just for demonstration purposes. If you need to set the variable multiple times, so maybe you wanted to do set count plus 1, and then you wanted to do whatever logic here, and then you wanted to set it again. This is just to bring out bring up the fact that this one might not be updated yet while you're still in this function and you're getting to this line of code. So if you want to use multiple set counts in the same function here, it is better to use the internal count that you have access to increment or to do whatever you need to update it with. Yeah, so yes, this could definitely be, yeah, so now it'll increment by 3, 3, 6, 9.
Okay, understood, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Other questions? Okay. I'm gonna comment this one out. Actually, I'll just delete it. Okay. I'm gonna just Will not. All right, so our function works. Let's see what else I didn't cover.
I had a question about how we're calling this function between the app and the component.
Okay,
So inside the app, we're saying its name, but then in the component, we're calling the file the same thing as the function. Is that just good practice, or which one is it actually looking for inside the app?
so import, this first one is going to be the name of the component, and then
Okay.
from is going to be the file name. So I usually, this one is an anomaly because I named it the exact same thing as the function name, but I usually put my my file names, I start it with a lowercase letter, just so I keep that distinction. So yeah, so you can
Okay.
do this. Yeah. Okay. Let me create, so we created this message one that just had these two elements. Let me show you how we can actually create a class method, just so you're aware of what they look like and how they work. So I'm going to call this class message.jsx. Okay. So for this one, I need to import component from React. So I need to import something called component. And then I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call this message, or I'm going to call it class message actually. Let me remember the syntax for this. React class component. Okay, so this class is going to extend this component, so it allows us to have certain built-in functions that this component would have. So we would say extends
is it React dot component?
yeah, that's, so I imported the component itself. If I imported React, I would have to say React.component.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so I can just use the component itself. Component. And then curly braces. So within this class, there's a method called render. So our program is going to look for this render method specifically to know what we render. And inside of this render method, oops, sorry. It's a method. It's a function. And then it has curly braces. So within this render method, this is where we put our return statement. So return. We have H1. Greetings. So for the props, we have access to the props within this class because we made it extend component. So this is a built-in functionality, and we would say this dot props dot greeting. I have to put it in curly braces like before. So let me put these side by side. Okay. Okay, we can ignore. I'm just gonna delete it for now, and then we'll go back to what it looked like. So let's say here, there's a div. We surrounded this. Okay. So this is basically the same thing. I can actually just copy this code in here. Okay, so for the functional components. Okay, now these are similar. So I'm not using Axios. Okay, so the signature is a little different. So here we have to define it as a class and say that it extends component. So it's a class that is a type component coming from React. And then within this component, we have a render function, and this render function will contain everything that we want to return. So we will return stuff here. We can put our logic in here. So you can have variables that you can set here. So constant something equals 4 or something like that. And then you can use it in here. If you want to write function handlers or like button click handlers like we did over here. So here we set increment counter, then you would put it right above here. So you would say that, increment counter. So this is a function, and then you put stuff within it. I think you have to specify that. No, you don't specify that it's a function. So it's an internal method. So you just put this, and then you can return whatever you want. So count +1 or something like that. So yeah, you can create functions. You can use these functions here. There's a bit more setup. There's a constructor for this because it's a class. So you can use a constructor and set your state. So with class components, you can't use the use state hook. You would have to use a different syntax for it. But yeah, this is generally how it looks. So it's pretty similar. It just has a few extra things. And I believe you still have to export it. I don't know, maybe not. Okay, anyways. This is, yeah. Any questions on this?
Yeah, what's this?
So this, if you go back to OOP in Python, we had self. So self, yeah, self gives you access to the instance of this class. This does the same. So this gives you access to the instance of this class. So this class has props, and within this props, there's a greeting.
So shouldn't 15 and 16 be this dot prop subtext, dot subtext?
Yes, it should be. This is why you shouldn't just copy code it. Okay. Yes, thank you for that catch. But yeah, that's generally the differences. And if I import it and use it over there, it'll be the same.
I might have missed this. What's the purpose of having a class like this versus the way you did it before?
So this used to be the old convention of doing things. So it's just a different way of doing it, and React, it's like the people who wrote the React library are moving away from using class-based components to using functional-based components because it's easier to write. There's a few less moving parts, so you don't have this render method. You don't have to extend the component. from React, you also could use state. And there's specific functionality that they've added specific to functional components that is not part of class components. And yeah, it's just a new way of doing things, and that is the new convention. So most people now write in functional components, but you might still see code that existed using class components. So it's important to know the differences.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So like they're adding on to this new function-based one, like you said, with this use state there, and the other way we're just, hey, this is kind of what you might see this in old code or something.
Exactly. So with state, there's like this dot, I think there's set state or this dot state. Oh, we can't access, sorry. We can only access it through here. So yeah, I think constant.
You have to put the state in the, I'm just looking at the docs. Do you have to put the state in the constructor?
Yeah, you do. You have to set it up. So constructor, this is equivalent to the init in Python. So we have that dunder init method that gets called whenever we instantiate a class. So the constructor basically is that. So when our constructor is called, we want to set our new state. So this dot state equals, and then you send in a dictionary of what your state, you want your initial state to be. So if I wanted count, I would say count equals 0, no, count like that. And if I want a different piece of state, something, this one. Okay. And then to update it, if I wanted on a button click to update it, I would have to say this dot set state. Oops, dot set state. And I believe I have to send in the key. So I want to update count, and I will send in the actual like what I want it to update to. This could be wrong, but yeah, so a little more code that's written. So instead of setting it like this, this gives you access to the setter and the function itself. So yeah, it's just typically easier to navigate around. Yeah, the classes can get messy. I agree. We'll revisit them. We'll see more examples of them later on, but we won't be writing class components. Yeah. Questions? Okay. So what else? So we touched on our functional components. We showed that example. Okay. We have, let's revisit our app. So when we start our dev server, it renders an HTML page. This HTML page contains a JavaScript script or a JSX script, which is called main.jsx. And this script takes a DOM element. So a DOM element called root. So if we look at our index, there's this dev with the root ID. So, oops, sorry. So it creates the root of our application. So this is specific to React. It creates the root of our application at this element, so at that div, and then dot render renders whatever is inside of here. So React.strict mode is specific React functionality that does extra error checking. So it helps you when you're debugging. It's not needed, but it's very recommended. It's better to have it in there. So if our app was very bare bones, this would be the only thing in here. So we have our app that is being rendered inside of this main.jsx. No. Okay, just gonna put this back. Okay, so our main app is being rendered into that div with the ID root. And then if we look into our app, this is going to be all the code that is put onto our app, into our page. So we have a div, we have a button counter component that we had created and imported. And we also have 2 message components that we had created and imported. So if we look back at what was it, 7 something? It takes a bit of getting used to.
5173.
Thank you. 5173. So now we see our click button component, and then we see our 2 message components here. So our button counter is coming from here. We have it rendering a div that contains a button element and a paragraph element that, a paragraph element. So when this button is clicked, it calls this function that we had set. And what this function does is it sets the state that we had defined to whatever it used to be +1. So this is what this code is doing. Line 5 is creating a new piece of state for us to use. So we wanted to use count and keep track of it while our application is running. So this gets reset every time your component is not on the screen anymore. So here, if I refresh, that means my component was not on my screen anymore and it reloaded. So state lives within the component's lifecycle. So it renders, it is there, you can do all this computation and stuff like that. But then if I had, like if I refresh, the component dies and then a new one comes up. And that's why when we refresh, we see count was set to 0. But yeah, so we're incrementing and we use set count to update any state that we have. Because if we don't use set count, React won't know to update this paragraph tag that uses the count. So it won't happen dynamically. You won't see a refresh on your screen. But using set count, whenever I click my button and it increments, I see it dynamically updating on the screen in real time. And then our message component was a simple component that takes in a few properties. It takes in greeting, and it takes in subtext, possibly. So we're checking if subtext is there, then we print out the subtext. If it's not there, then we print out no subtext provided. If we wanted to do the same error checking for the greeting, we can do that as well. Yeah. Let's see. There is one more thing. So let's say in this button counter, we wanted to create our own button and our own display. So we wanted to create an element called my label or something like that. And then I wanted to create a button called my button. So with this, let's create those real quick. So in here, I'm going to create my label. I just realized that I named this with the lowercase. I need to update that. So .jsx. And then I want to also create my button. I know right now we don't have a lot of functionality or a lot of stuff inside of here, but let's say we do. Let's say we have more than just this one line of code. And I want to, and this component, this button counter component is getting a little busy. So I'm gonna separate these components out and create my own. So this button one, I'm gonna go into my button that I just created. I'm going to create a new button. So constant my button equals this, and then I'm going to return, put a div here, and then I'm going to put the button component here. And then I'm going to do the same with my label. I'm going to grab that functionality and put it in there. So my label here, this is going to be constant, my label. What's that? We're going to return a div. And within this div, I'm going to put my my tag here. Okay. So my button and my label are currently hold the information. I'm going to import it. So something is not going to work. And you guys can probably guess why. So I want to import my button. / components. Oh, this is within the components. So / my button, and then import my label from / my label. Okay. So if we look at these, so my button is using the increment counter function, and my label is using the actual count to be displayed. So my increment counter is using this state, but each one of these is kind of using a separate one. So my label uses the count, and then my button uses the set count, which in reality, my button is using this function here. So instead of putting this functionality in one or the other, I will keep this functionality here because it's shared between the two, right? So my label is taking in the count, so I can actually just send in the count. So I send in the count here. And then for my button, I can just send in the function that we're using here. So, or I can call it like click handler or whatever you want to call it. So my click handler is going to be this function here. And so when I'm inside my label, since I'm sending in the count, I will access it through the props. So I put the props up here. And now I can say props dot count because I'm sending in the count as props into my label here. And I can do the same with my button. So I called it my button, I called it click handler. So in my props, I will have access to click handler. So here, when my button needs an on-click function, I can say, so I'm gonna grab my props real quick. And then here I'm gonna say props dot click handler, because that's what I called it. So now I saved everything. If I go back to my app, let's see what went wrong. My button.jsx does not exist. Oh, I'm not exporting it. So if you're trying to import a function and it's not doing the autocorrect or the autocomplete, check if you have an export function. So export defaults my label. So this happens to me. Okay, so export default my label, and then I'm gonna also do the same with my button. So export default my button. And now if I go back, I refresh, there we go. So if I click, it's still working. So you can abstract the functionality out into multiple components and then have them share the same state. So both the button and the label change the count state or use it. So I can keep the state information inside of my button counter component, but I can have separate components within it that use the function that I wrote or use the state itself to display. Any questions on this?
Can you?
Yeah, we didn't have to export the class message. When you did that example, you didn't have to export a class, right?
Yes, it wasn't working because I wasn't exporting here.
No, I meant for a class message.jsx. The one the example.
Oh, class message? No, I did not export it.
So you don't have to export class. Okay, good. All right, thanks.
Yeah. Someone else was gonna ask a question.
Can you scroll up to the button counter up top? Because so you're just importing my button, my label like that, and then that's what happens when you call it on your return there.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Other questions? Okay.
I know that we're gonna pretend like it doesn't exist, but can you show how to import the class message? Like use the class message to show the page?
Let's do that. So I'm gonna go back to my app. I'm gonna import it here. So import class message. I might need an export. Let's see. From / components / class message. Okay. And then I'm gonna put it right here. Actually, I can do that. Okay. So if I go back here, I'm getting an error. Oh, okay. So instead of exporting, you still have to set the default thing. So class, you have to just put default here. This is just related to, or is it default here or? Yes, export. So you do have to export it, but here you put it in the beginning of the class. So you say export default, then you set the class. I believe you can also put it at the end, but this is typically how it's done. So I'm going back to my app. So now I imported it here. I'm displaying it here, so I should be able to see it if I refresh. Okay. Must call super and constructor. Okay. We've seen that before. This is just because I used the constructor. You must call super if you are creating your own constructor, which is similar to what we saw in class components. Okay, now it works. So this is the class component greeting that I had. I'm not sending in anything, but I can. So it takes in the greeting and it takes in the subtext. So if I go back to my app function or app component, and I actually sent those in. So I'm just gonna copy this one. Or I'm gonna say class component greeting. So I'm gonna save. And there it is. So it outputs the class component greeting. Good. Okay, two more things before we break for lunch. So let's say, where should we add this? I'm gonna close out this, close out that. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my message component. And let's see. Actually, in app, let's say I want a bunch of messages. I want like 100 messages printed out. And I don't really care about specializing the greeting. Maybe I want it to be something like not too much. So I can actually create an array of these and display them in line here. So let's do that. So function display 100 messages. Okay, so I'm gonna create an array. I'm gonna create an empty array, and then I can create a for loop. So for let I equal 0, I is less than 100, I plus plus. Okay, so for everyone, I would like to create a new message element, let's say. So I can just do messages.push. So this is equivalent to array.append. So this adds a new item to my array. So I'm gonna create a new, oops. Here I'm gonna create a new message. Message. Instead of this, I'm gonna have it contain like this, and maybe the greeting I want to be let's use the backticks to have a message, and then interpolate. So maybe we want to put the name is, this is, oh, so anything you want to send in to these props, you have to put in curly braces. That's why I was giving the squigglies. So I can say this is message, and then add the index, maybe. So let's do that. This and then I. Okay, so this is message, whatever, and then it'll print out the index of this. And then after I put all my messages into this list, I'm going to return these messages. So what this function is returning is a list of a bunch of messages. So it's a list of message tags pretty much. And all I need to do here is use my curly braces because I want to call a function and just say display 100 messages with the parentheses here. And if I save, there we go. So this is message 1, 0, 1, and it keeps going all the way until 100 or until 99 because that's what we sent. But yeah, this is the way you can print out a list of elements. So if I wanted, let's say I wanted to keep this in state. So if I had import use state. So also we have to remember that use state is going to be in curly braces because React exports more than just this function. So we have to use the curly braces to specify that we want this. But so here we don't have to put the curly braces because this is the only thing that this message file is exporting. So it's exporting a default one, and this is how we can access it. So I did the use state. I'm gonna create a state. So constant, what am I gonna call this? Messages, and then set messages. State, sorry, use state. And then I'm gonna just initialize it as an empty array. And then in here, when we want to display all the messages and when we're creating them, I'm gonna use the same messages that are here. So instead of messages.push, you can do actually here. So we'll do let new messages equal to this. So we're gonna push everything to an array here. And then instead of returning it, actually we can return, it doesn't matter. Okay, I'm gonna set messages. And when I set these messages, I'm gonna have to say, yeah, set messages and then this new array, right? I just created this new messages. So what this function does is it sets the messages. Actually, this might break things. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Let's not do that. Okay. So the reason why I went back on this is because set messages will call the component to re-render, and when the component gets re-rendered, it'll call the function again, which sets the messages again, so it'll end up in an infinite loop. There's a different hook like use state called use effect that we will learn about. And this use effect will allow us to put functionality in the code that will only run like at the first time a component renders or the last time it renders. So we'll talk about that more. But anyways, you can create a list, you can append a bunch of data, and then you can return it to be displayed in an element. Yeah, I do want to show a different example, but
I have a quick question. I forgot, I think you mentioned this, but I already forgot. In your new messages.push, why is this is message in the curly brackets again?
Here, this is because
Yeah.
so this entire thing, or this at least, is being assigned to an attribute. So in HTML, when you're setting something equal to this, so if I had this, it's, one sec. So the curly braces are because I'm trying to use the backticks. So if I was just using a regular string, so if I was using just, this is message, so this would work. But because I wanted to use a backtick and a variable, that is specific like JavaScript logic. So you have to put it inside of curly braces.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Okay. There was one example about more complex state updating. It's at the bottom of the lesson today. I do want to show this real quick. Okay. Elements dot push. Actually, yeah, we'll show that tomorrow. Let's not. Any questions on this? What we learned today? Awesome.